I've got a spa day booked, Carol. You'll figure it out. That's what my daughter-in-law told me 2 hours before my hip replacement when I called to confirm she was still driving me to the hospital. My name is Carol Whitmore. I am 73 years old, and this is the story of the morning I found out exactly who I could count on, and the paperwork I'd already quietly signed months before that made sure it didn't wreck me. Welcome to Grandma Never Forgets. I had been putting off this hip replacement for nearly 2 years, the way you put off things that frighten you a little, until the pain finally left me no choice but to schedule it for a Thursday morning in May. My son Kevin offered back in March to have his wife Melissa drive me, since Kevin himself would be traveling for work that week, and Melissa agreed readily enough at the time, penciling it into whatever calendar young people keep these days. I trusted that arrangement completely, the way you trust the small logistics of your own family without a second thought, right up until 6:30 that Thursday morning. When I called to confirm and Melissa answered, sounding distracted and slightly annoyed that I was calling so early. "Carol," she said, "I've actually got a spa day booked with my sister today. We planned it weeks ago. I completely forgot your surgery was today, too. You'll figure it out, right? Maybe a neighbor? Or one of those medical transport services?" I stood in my kitchen at 6:30 in the morning, 4 hours before a hip replacement, being told by the woman who'd agreed to drive me that a spa day had priority. I want you to understand what that particular kind of cold does to a person. Standing there in slippers with an overnight bag already packed by the door, doing math about who else might possibly be free on 4 hours' notice on a Thursday. Here is what saved that morning, and honestly saved a great deal more than that morning. I have a neighbor named Doris, 78 years old herself, sharp as a tack, who I've had coffee with most mornings for 11 years, ever since her husband passed, and mine did too, within a year of each other. Back in February, 3 months before this surgery was even scheduled, Doris and I had one of those long, honest conversations two old widows have when they're being realistic about their remaining years. And out of that conversation, I made a decision I hadn't yet told my son about. I went to my attorney and formally updated my healthcare power of attorney, naming Doris, not Kevin, as my primary healthcare proxy and emergency decision maker, with Kevin listed only as a secondary backup. I also gave Doris a spare key and made her, in writing, my designated emergency contact for exactly this kind of situation: medical appointments, procedures, anything requiring a driver or a decision on short notice. I hadn't told Kevin about any of that, not out of spite, but because it felt at the time like an unnecessary conversation to have with the son, who I assumed, reasonably, would simply show up when it mattered. I called Doris at 6:35 that morning, 5 minutes after Melissa's call, my voice steadier than I felt, and Doris, bless her, was in her car in her bathrobe within 4 minutes, telling me to grab my bag. She'd change at the hospital if she had to. Doris drove me to that hospital, sat with me through admissions, and when the intake nurse asked for my emergency contact and healthcare decision maker, Doris was the name already sitting right there in my chart, current and legally documented, no scrambling required. I went into surgery at 10 that morning with the one person who'd actually shown up holding my hand in pre-op, and I want to tell you, there is a particular kind of peace in not needing to wonder in that vulnerable moment whether the people who were supposed to be there would actually be there. Kevin found out what happened the way most people find out the truth in families like ours, sideways, through a phone call that wasn't meant to reveal anything at all. He called that evening from his work trip to check on how the surgery went, expecting, I think, to hear that Melissa had handled everything smoothly, and instead reached me groggy and sore in a hospital bed, telling him plainly that Doris had been my ride, my contact, and my proxy that day because Melissa had a spa appointment she didn't want to miss. There was a long silence on that call, the kind that tells you a man is doing arithmetic he doesn't want to do. "She told me she was driving you," he finally said. I asked him gently whether he'd actually confirmed that with Melissa himself at any point in the 2 months since she'd agreed to it, or whether he'd simply trusted it would happen because it was written on a calendar somewhere. He admitted quietly that he hadn't checked, that he'd assumed the way people assume things that are actually someone else's responsibility to verify. What came out over the following days, once Kevin got home and had a real conversation with Melissa, was that the spa day had been booked for nearly a month, well after she'd agreed to drive me, and that she'd simply decided privately that a hospital pickup at 6:30 in the morning wasn't worth rearranging her own plans for, assuming, correctly as it turned out, that someone else would probably handle it if she just didn't show up. Kevin was angrier about that particular calculation than I have seen him in years, not just because of what it did to me, but because of what it revealed about how easily his wife had been willing to let his mother's safety become someone else's problem. Melissa came to see me at home once I was recovering, sat by my bed looking genuinely uncomfortable, and told me she was sorry that she hadn't fully thought through what canceling would actually mean for me that morning, that she'd told herself in the moment that surely I'd find another way. I told her I had found another way and that the other way's name was Doris, a woman who is not my daughter-in-law and who nonetheless understood instantly at 6:30 in the morning that showing up matters more than any spa day ever could. I told her I wasn't interested in punishing her forever for one selfish morning, but that going forward she would not be listed as my emergency contact for anything, medical or otherwise, and that decision had already been made quietly months before this surgery ever happened, which was the only reason that morning hadn't turned into a genuine crisis. Kevin has been different since that Thursday, more careful, more willing to check things himself instead of assuming Melissa or anyone else has them handled. He drove me to my follow-up appointment himself, took the whole day off for it, sat in the waiting room the entire time even though he didn't need to, the way I think he wished he'd been in that pre-op room in May. Doris and I still have coffee most mornings, and we laugh now, gently, about the bathrobe she drove me to the hospital in, though under the laughing, we both know exactly what that morning actually was. A test neither of us saw coming that she passed without a second's hesitation, and a family member who failed it and had to live with what that failure revealed about herself. That is my story. One healthcare proxy quietly updated 3 months before I needed it, and an old woman who learned that the person who shows up isn't always the person the paperwork used to say should. If you've ever found out in a moment that mattered exactly who you could really count on, this is your reminder to make sure your own paperwork reflects reality, not just assumption. Drop a comment and tell me who your Doris is. Subscribe to Grandma Never Forgets, and I will see you in the next one.